Good evening. I'm Stephen Chapley. I'm the executive chef here at Cordon Bleu, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I want to welcome you into our kitchen for a little demo tonight. Chef Stacy Stapleton and I are going to talk about some fun ways to use a classical technique in ways that you may not have thought of. We're going to talk about braising, but the traditional braise is probably what most of us have experienced in a Sunday pot roast. It is a moist method of cooking used to take large cuts of meat that are often not very tender, that have quite a bit of fat or connective tissue that needs to be broken down. So by cooking it slow and low with a lot of moisture, it breaks that down and makes it more tender. It's also a good way to get flavor concentrated and into your main ingredient. But what we're going to do today is several things that use the concept of braising, of cooking with that moisture in a way that is applicable to different products that don't necessarily need to be broken down, products that aren't even meat, but ways that you can use that concentration and that moist method of making really good food that's fun and that's applicable to the summer foods. What I'm going to start with is the closest thing we're going to do to a traditional braise tonight. It's going to be a quick braised pork using apples and cherries. So the pork brisket that I'm using, it's a cut that a lot of people aren't really used to using. We often use the brisket in beef, but not always in pork. So this is a very tender cut. It's going to cook pretty quick, doesn't have a lot of fat, doesn't have a lot of connective tissue, but it can play well with those flavors. So we've dried our meat really well. We're going to season it with salt and pepper. We're going to let that sit for a little bit. So when you're doing a braise, you've got your main ingredient. That's going to be pork in this instance. And then you use a liquid. Our liquid is going to be chicken stock and apple juice. And then we're going to add a garnish to flavor that liquid. And the things we're going to use tonight are parsnips and apples. So when you're cutting your garnish, you need to keep in mind how long you're going to be cooking. In a classic braise, when we were doing a big piece of meat, something that needs to break down, you're going to want pretty big cuts of vegetables because you don't want it to break down too quick. You want it to release the flavor into the broth. But like I say, since we're doing this quick and this meat doesn't really need to break down, we're going to do pretty small knife cuts. We're going to do about a medium dice on the parsnip and the apple as well. So one of the reasons we want these nice and small is because we really do want them to break down. We're going to use them in our sauce, and so we want them to be good and soft. We want them to have absorbed the other flavors of the braise when we do that. So I'm cutting these in about the same size as the parsnip. So that they hold up, but they're soft enough that we can grind them into our sauce when we get done. The other thing I'm going to flavor our sauce and our braise with is a shallot. We're not making a large amount, and we don't need a super strong flavor, so we're just going to use a medium to small one. The shallots I had were pretty big, so I'm going to use a half. Here again, we want a knife cut that matches what we're cooking. And we're going to cook this pretty fast, so we want a pretty small dice on these shallots. And shallots can be pretty strong, but I think they add something nice to this dish. Okay, so we've got all of our flavorings ready. We're going to get a pan going on medium heat. Now one thing about braising that makes the technique work is you saute your meat. If you're going to saute meat, you get a really good brown on it. Then you take it out of the pan, you add your other flavoring ingredients, and then you put your meat back in. So you get a lot of flavor off the browning of the meat that goes back into the liquid and then therefore cooks into your main ingredient. When we saute for a braise, we use a really light oil because we don't want the flavors of the oil to overpower the flavor of our ingredients. Something like an olive oil would really be too much. You'd really get a bitterness from the way we're going to cook all these things, especially if you were doing a traditional braise where it was going to cook for a long time. Okay, so our pan's good and hot. I'm going to start our brisket. Now you want to use a pan that's big enough that you don't crowd the meat, but you don't want it too big that all these flavors aren't going to meld nicely together. One reason I like to use this cut of meat, you could also use a pork tenderloin, or if you had a couple nice boneless pork chops from the loin, you could do that as well. You want to make sure you're using something that's a good inch thick, but it cooks pretty quick. It takes up all the flavors and it concentrates the way braise should, but it doesn't take all day. So it's good for entertaining, good for summertime because the pork is a nice light meat, and you're going to see the things that we use in this braise go for a nice sauce as well. Okay, so we're going to let that get a good brown. The liquids I'm going to use for this braise, I'm going to use half chicken stock and half apple juice. We're also going to deglaze with a little bit of brandy. It just gives a little bit of brightness to our braise. One thing that can happen with braises is there's so much stuff, and if you cook it too hot or for too long, it can get kind of a dull flavor. So you want to make sure and use bright flavors, and that everything you apply to it is going to keep it nice and bright. You're going to want to avoid garlic in most braises because here again, with the length of cooking, you're going to get a bitterness off of that garlic, and it's just going to be too strong. If you do want a garlic flavor maybe in your sauce, you can add it at the end. So when we're talking about a braise and what makes it different from other cooking methods, it uses moisture to apply the heat from below because the food's in it, and then the steam around it because we're going to cap it tightly. Braising is similar to stewing, but usually when you stew, you use a lot more liquid. The liquid is going to cover your main product and your ingredients, and it's usually eaten all together. Whereas with the braise, you only use the liquid up to about 2/3 up the side of your main product. And the liquid is often used as a sauce, but not always. Okay, so we're getting a good brown on these briskets. I'm going to turn my heat down just a little bit. See, that's about the color we want. And you got to remember, we're not cooking this right now. The meat's going to cook in the liquid when we get our braise going. We're just getting a good color on our meat and a good flavor. And we're getting this good fond color right in here. There's a lot of flavor in there. So shallots going first. Let them release some of their flavor. Then I'll put the other hard vegetables in. Does anybody have any questions out there? What are some of the things you've braised? Have you braised very often? Yep. If you do want a garlic flavor, that's actually what I would suggest. I'd suggest that you add it later. The question was asked, could you add garlic later? Absolutely. Get some fresh garlic, put it in close to the end. I'm going to deglaze with some brandy, get some of that fond off the bottom. Yeah, it's not necessarily the garlic flavor that you want to avoid, it's just that bitterness that your garlic can get on it. Okay, so we've sweated our garnish. We got a little bit of color. Add my stock. Add my apple juice. Now you can see it's not very deep. It's not going to cover those pieces of brisket when I put them in there. Okay, while that's going, we're going to season our braising liquid. I've got some fresh thyme. And always salt and pepper. Because remember, this is going to be our sauce when we get done. So we want it good and flavorful, nice and seasoned, good and balanced, not super sweet. Okay, now this braise and the sauce we make with it is going to have cherries, but I'm not going to cook the cherries with it. We're going to use that kind of bright, fresh, tart flavor of the cherries and throw them in at the end. Okay, as you can see, a good third of that meat is still sticking out of our liquid, and it's just on top of that garnish there. The stock I used tonight was chicken stock, and then the other liquid I had was apple juice. Excellent question. Okay, so now that our liquid's up to heat, so the question is, why use apple juice? The apple juice just gives a little bit of a sweetness and, like I said, a brightness. Often I think braises need some kind of acidity and a little bit of tartness, so they're not too heavy, meaty, and pork goes great with apples. Plus that light apple juice is going to pair well with the cherry flavors when we add them later. So because we're using a very lean piece of meat here, you could use chicken, even chicken breast if you really wanted. You wouldn't cook it as long, but you could use a boneless, skinless chicken breast and cook it for a very short time. But like I said, this braise is nice because it really doesn't take a super long time. Some of the other things we're cooking tonight we've done with the magic of TV, and we've got one done ahead of time, but this is actually going to cook in real time. It's a pretty small piece of meat, and you don't have to cook the heck out of it for it to be tender. The question was asked, do you have to use brandy to deglaze? No, not necessarily. If you wanted to go with a different flavor, you could use a Calvados, you could use an Applejack. If you wanted to incorporate another flavor, you could use that. And if you don't like to use alcohol, you could just use some more chicken stock or apple juice. That's an excellent question. Okay, so I've put that in the oven. We're going to let that cook about 30 minutes at about 325 degrees. And then when it gets done, the pork's going to be ready to slice after it rests a little bit. And then we're going to make a sauce. So now I'm going to move on to a really fun dish that we're going to braise. We're going to braise watermelon. Once again, obviously not something that's really tough that needs to break down a lot. There's not a lot of connective tissue or anything like that. But when we add these flavors and when we add the heat and cook this watermelon down, it really does some interesting things to the flesh of the watermelon. It changes the sweetness, it changes the texture, and it makes for a really fun appetizer dish. So the question was asked, can you use another cut of meat in the dish that I used, pork? Yeah, you could. You probably would want to avoid anything really big. I don't think beef would work with this, but other small, light cuts of pork, like a tenderloin, like a chunk of loin or good loin chops. Any piece of chicken on the bone or not on the bone. If you wanted to go really low fat, you could go with a boneless, skinless breast. But any kind of light meat like that would work really good. Okay, so I've sliced this watermelon into slabs that are about 1.5 inches thick, and I've cut them into pieces that are about 2 by 5. So here again, this is a little different than a classic braise. We don't need to break things down. We don't need to cook low and slow. In fact, we're going to cook kind of long and hot on this watermelon. It's kind of counter to what we're used to in a braise because we're used to breaking down those cartilage and connective tissues. But this high heat, we're going to cook this at 350 degrees for about 2.5 hours. So for our liquid, There's already a lot of liquid in the watermelon, obviously, so a lot of the flavor and liquid for this braise is going to come from that. And then we're also going to use cream sherry. A pretty good amount of it. The recipe that we're putting out there is for twice as much watermelon as I'm making, and it's for an entire half bottle of cream sherry. So we're going to drizzle the cream sherry over the watermelon. Let that kind of soak in there. We don't need as much liquid because, like I say, when it cooks, a lot of liquid is going to come out of the watermelon. Then we're going to season our watermelon with salt and pepper. And don't hold back. I mean, we really want to season it. This is not a light little fruit dish when it comes out. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is a substantial, fairly savory dish after this watermelon cooks. Then I got a little bit of smoked paprika. That just adds a little bit of depth. Put that right on top. Any other questions? Those have been great questions. Then we're going to add dabs of butter. Now this one definitely isn't low fat because of the butter, but when you see what it does to the texture of the watermelon and when you taste it, you'll be amazed. So one thing we're going to do different with this dish, we're going to make a cartouche. A cartouche is a piece of parchment paper that goes on top of something you're cooking that controls the amount of liquid that can escape and that stays in to cook the product you're cooking. So we're folding in a radius, and then we're going to cut this so that it fits our pan. Got a little too big. We're going to put this right down on top of our watermelon. And then once again, we're going to cover with foil. We want to get this very tight on this watermelon dish. You want to make sure you got a pretty heavy pan for this braising because it's at that high heat. It's really going to brown the bottom of our watermelon. We don't want it to burn. For the watermelon, yeah, you know what? You could use you could make a fruit stock if you don't like to use alcohol in your cooking. You could make a fruit stock or with a little bit of apple juice and maybe some citrus. And I think that would work. That could work really well. You're not going to get the same. There's kind of a raisiny quality of the sherry that you get in this dish that you won't get, but it would still be good, and it'll still do the same thing to the watermelon. The butter, somebody asked how much butter. You use about 2/3 of a stick when you do a full recipe. I did about a half recipe for this demo. Any more than that would really be too much, and you would you'd get a little bit greasy. So I wouldn't go much more than that. Somebody asked if you could add cheese. Yeah, I think cheese and watermelon go well together. I don't think I would cook it with a cheese, but maybe a nice cheese when you're serving it. Feta cheese or something light, maybe a fresh mozzarella would be good. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, so let's take a look at our pork braise. Okay, you can see the liquid is going down a little bit. The flavors are melting. Getting a great apple and thyme smell coming off of here. But our pork needs to go just a little bit more. I'm going to put that back in. Okay, want to talk about dessert?
I'd love to, Chef.
All right, Chef Stacy is the dessert queen, and I am not so great at desserts, but this is a good way to highlight another fruit that braises well. We're going to braise some peaches. So somebody asked a question, what's the difference using parchment versus a lid? Getting that parchment right down on your meat keeps those flavors and the liquid that's coming off of the meat and off of that braise keeps it right on the meat. It kind of forces it into your main ingredient more than a lid would. With a lid, it's able to get up higher, so it's just concentrating the steam and the flavors. And that's why you use the parchment first. Even though you're doing a lid, when you're doing it that way, the lid is keeping in more of the heat, and that cartouche or the parchment is pushing that moisture straight back onto your main ingredient. But those are great questions. So, braising peaches.
Yes, Chef.
Sounds lovely.
I'm super excited.
So why don't you talk about what we're going to do with them, Chef Stacy, while I get some peaches ready.
Well, Chef came to me and said I'm going to braise peaches, which I have to confess I've never done before. So I was really intrigued, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a tart shell out of a dough called pâte sucrée, and then I'm going to fill it with a cream known as crème chantilly and put my braised peaches on top. I'm going to serve it with a sorbet and a tuile, and I have a couple of nice plate sauces to add to flavor as well. So that's what I was thinking, Chef.
Well, why don't you show us the crust? That way we'll have the crust ready when we get our peaches out.
Okay. I'm going to roll out my pâte sucrée. I'm going to move your board over, Chef. I have my pâte sucrée already made. Pâte sucrée is a typical sugar dough that you're going to find in a bake shop. It's what makes the fruit tart so tasty. Sometimes it's the fruit that's the best on top. Other times it's the crust that's the star of the show. So I have a small little bit. I'm going to flour my board here.
How is this crust different than like a Pillsbury Botten crust that I normally buy at the store?
That's a really good question, Chef. This dough is made with small amounts of egg yolk and cream, and it also uses all-purpose flour and butter and powdered sugar. So it makes it, known as a short dough, so it makes it really, really tender and bakes up nice and crisp. It holds up well to liquidy fruit fillings, like if you were going to do pastry cream, or it would even hold creme anglaise. So I'm going to move you over.
So it's less flaky.
It is less flaky. It's more durable. So here we are. Push my stuff back together here. So I'm going for about 1/4 inch thickness on my dough. I don't want it to be too thick. I don't want it to be too thin. I want it to be the Goldilocks, just right. So I'm going to go ahead and fit this over, and I'm going to use my fingers, and I'm going to lift up, and I'm going to tuck in my dough. And it's still very cold at this point. When this dough is warm, it's really hard to work with. It tears, and you just might as well just put it in the fridge and start over. Okay.
So when I'm cooking for parties, I like to have stuff that I can have done ahead of time. How much of this crust can I have done
You can have
ahead
it,
of time?
you can do it all ahead of time, and you can do it days ahead of time. Kept out at room temperature, wrapped really tightly, it will stay good for a long while. So I've got my dough kind of tucked into my corners, and you notice I was lifting up and tucking in with my fingers, being careful not to poke all the way through. If you do poke a hole, it's not the end of the world. Just grab a little bit of your edge dough and then tuck it in, and you'll do just fine. So in order to trim this off, I'm just going to use my pin. And then my dough comes off, and I have a really nice fluted edge.
Very pretty.
Thank you, Chef. So I'm going to put it on my baking sheet, and one thing that's really important to remember about pâte sucrée is that now I'm going to put this in the fridge, and I'm going to let it chill down. I don't want to bake it right away, because then all the butter is going to be kind of warm and worked, and then my tart dough is just going to kind of run together, and it's not going to turn out the way that I want it to. So, but when it comes time to baking, it's really important that, number one, your dough is super cold. So if you're in a really warm kitchen, like most other people are, then you can set it into the fridge or the freezer. I'm going to pull it out, and then I'm going to do what we call blind baking. Can I say what was in the dough again? This is pâte sucrée, so it's powdered sugar. It is cream and an egg yolk, all-purpose flour, and am I missing something? I'm missing something.
Powdered sugar?
Butter. Yes, butter. Butter good. Yes. So I'm using little tiny pieces of parchment paper. I'm not going to use a giant piece of parchment paper. And I'm going to tuck in my beans, and this is how I'm going to bake. So what the beans do, this is again called blind bake. I'll put this right here. This is called blind baking, and what the beans do is it holds down the dough so that my dough bakes nice and flat. It doesn't come out super bumpy, because I want to have room for my filling, right? Which is kind of the best part. So I do this, and then I'm going to bake it probably in a wind oven. I would do 325 degrees for about 8 to 10 minutes until I notice that the edges where I can see under my parchment are getting to be golden. Then I'm going to open my oven. I'm going to pull out. I'm going to take off the beans, and I'm going to continue to bake until the dough is super crispy and ready to go. Well, not super crispy. I want it a delicious golden brown. So that's how I'm doing my tart shell, Chef. And any extra dough I have, I can just reuse it, put it back, and use it for my next adventure.
It's not going to get too tough?
No.
Like some bread doughs do?
No, it's not going to get too tough.
Very good.
It stands up pretty well. So
very cool. Let
me clean up my mess, Chef.
All right, then we'll move to the braised part of this dish, and that's the peaches. This kind of tart shell is a great little trick to have in your sleeve of tools, because you can highlight so many great, whether it's fruits, or if you have custards that you want to use, cherries. Anytime something's in season, you can put it in a tart shell with a little bit of cream, and you're going to have a great dessert.
Yeah. And another nice thing about pâte sucrée is that it's traditionally made as a plain dough, but you can also add flavorings. If I have some sort of filling that's going to be augmented by citrus, then I can zest in an orange, or I can zest it in a lemon. You can also supplement with nut flours such as hazelnut meal or almond meal, if that's going to add to the round out the flavors of your dessert.
Very cool.
All right. Here you go, Chef.
All right. So we've got some gorgeous peaches. You know, and a lot of times when you know some of these things that you can use, you can just play off what looks good. Go to the farmer's market or go to the store you normally go to and look at what's in season. Look what looks great, and then you can, this braise we're doing now, you could do with apples. You could do with pears. You could do with peaches like we're doing, or nectarines. All the stone fruits work really good with it. And that's how I chose this. I had done it before with nectarines. And when I went to look at what looked good, these peaches looked awful good. All right, so here again I'm going to use a super light oil because we don't want that to take over too much of the flavor. And for our flavoring, we're going to use vanilla beans, and we're going to use a wine called Sauterne. Sauterne is a sweet white wine, sometimes referred to as a sticky because it is sometimes so sweet it's kind of sticky. We're going to cut open a bean. If you haven't used vanilla beans, this is what they look like. And we slice it open, and inside are all these millions of tiny itty-bitty flavor seeds, and that's where the vanilla flavor comes from. When you use a vanilla extract that you've bought at a store, it is alcohol that has been soaking with these little seeds. So we're going to scrape those out of the pod to make sure the flavor gets into our braising liquid really well. And then we're going to brown these peaches just like we did the pork. Those sugars are going to brown up really good. It's going to start our cooking process, and it's going to add flavor to the braising liquid. Okay, I'm just going to throw the pod right in there. That flavor is going to come out in the braising liquid as well. Okay, now that it's getting good and brown, I'm going to add our Sauterne. Okay, I'm burning off some of this liquid, not so much because I need to get rid of the alcohol. A lot of it's going to cook off anyway, but I want to kind of just reduce that wine so that we've got a thicker, more concentrated flavor that we can maybe even use as a sauce when we get our finished product. So you can smell already just from the pod all the vanilla flavor that's coming off in there. And I'm going to scrape the rest right into there. All right, here again, I'm just going to cook that wine down just a little bit. We don't need so much liquid in there because the peaches have a lot of their own liquid. It's going to come out as they cook. All right, that's pretty good. So here again, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to go into the oven. Get those edges tight. And into the oven we go. And I'm going to take out, and we're going to plate our watermelon. All right. So as you can see, that watermelon cooked down a lot. It is probably 1/3 of the thickness it was. So the question is, could you substitute the wine with something non-alcoholic? Absolutely. One thing that would work great with this, they make these juice nectars that come in a can. I think one of the brands is Goya. They have excellent concentrated flavors, and I'd play with one of those, a nectarine or something like that, with a peach. That could be a lot of fun to play with. Okay, so you can see that sherry really caramelized and the butter, and when we turn that watermelon over, we're going to see that it's browned almost like a steak would. And we're going to put it on a cooling rack and let some of those juices come out. We're going to use those juices in the dressing for our salad when we plate this. Okay, so we're going to do this watermelon with a little arugula salad with the dressing that's made from the pan drippings that came out of our watermelon and a little bit of cherry vinegar. So we're going to pour some of these drippings off into our pan. We don't need much dressing for this salad. We just kind of want to coat this arugula. So we're going to season with salt and pepper. I like to put a little honey in because that sherry can get a little bit of bitterness from the browning. Then just a little bit of sherry vinegar. Sherry vinegar is on the sweet side of vinegars, not as sweet as a balsamic, a little bit lighter. So it works really good with this salad. Okay, I'm going to taste it for seasoning. A little more salt and pepper, tad more vinegar. You guys had some great questions. Any more out there? What's something that most people don't think about braising that you think would make for a cool braise? Knowing what you know about braising now. Okay, I've got a couple super thin slices of red onion. I'm going to add to this salad and toss with it in the vinaigrette. That's a good question. That's what makes this really kind of a play on traditional braising. The question was, how much heat did we use for the watermelon? This was a hot braise. It was 350 degrees for 2.5 hours. So not at all the classic low and slow braise. So we've got our nice little arugula salad there. Clean up some of that dressing. Some of our braised watermelon. I'm just going to get a little more of that juice to put on our plate. So someone before mentioned cheese. You know, I think now if you wanted to do a cheese, this would be a good time to crumble some feta, either right on the watermelon or maybe on your salad. But that's going to be a very interesting, different first course you can serve for your friends in the middle of summer when Watermelon is perfect, and a nice little salad is going to make for a good first course, or even a light lunch, especially if you've got friends that are vegetarian. So now we're going to look at plating our pork. Okay, yep, this looks very good. So we're going to take our meat out, and we're going to let it rest a little bit. You always want to let cooked meat rest before you slice it so that it doesn't dry out. You're going to keep all those juices. You're going to allow them to slow down a little bit before you cut into them. Okay, so for this sauce, we're going to use the braise. There's a little too much liquid, so we want all the yummy good stuff, the parsnips and the shallot and the apple, and we don't need all of the liquid. So we're going to kind of keep some of that liquid in there. Okay. Now we're going to add fresh cherries. Bananas or pineapples in this, you know, play with it. I think it could be great, especially pineapple sounds good. There's a little bit of acidity. If you're going to do bananas, you'd probably want to add an acid so that you had a balance. Maybe lemon juice or limes or pineapple, banana and pineapple. Do a little pina colada pork. That sounds good. So I'm adding probably 15 or 16 fresh red cherries to this sauce. They're going to add a little bit of that acidity. They're going to add a great color. And right now, cherries are fantastic. So we're just going to puree all of this stuff. And I think a stick blender is perfect for this kind of thing. A few more cherries. All right. Now again, I'm going to taste for seasoning. We want to remember, we don't want this to be too sweet. It is a savory dish and a savory sauce. Definitely need salt and pepper. I'm going to hit it with some fresh thyme. There we go. Okay. All right, we've got our sauce nice, we've got our plate ready, and our pork's rested for a good few minutes. So like I say, this is a brisket flat, so you can see the grain is running this way in this pork, so we're going to want to cut against that grain in this direction. The watermelon, the question was asked, would the watermelon hold its texture if it was poached? It probably wouldn't. I've done it this way several times, and it's pretty fragile. It sometimes even just picking it up, it can lose its shape and kind of fall apart. So I think poaching would be a little too aggressive for it. So there's a very nice flavorful braised dish in 35 minutes by using a piece of meat. It doesn't have to break down, it's tender, it's small enough you can get the concentrated flavors in from your braise. And so it does everything a braise is supposed to do, but it takes less time. So, are we ready to plate some peaches?
Yes, chef.
Does anybody have questions about the dessert? Okay.
You will in just a minute, I promise. Okay. Ooh, those look great.
So again, we've got our liquid here that's got vanilla and the Sauterne wine. So when we take the peaches out, I'm going to reduce this liquid so that we've got some lovely, very flavorful sauce. Do you want to put these on the cutting board, Chef, or we're not ready for them yet?
I'm almost, yes, go ahead, please. Thank you. All right, so here I have my pâte sucrée, my tart shell, that has already been baked and is ready to go. You can tell what color we're going for, kind of a deep golden brown. And I've also made, pardon me, I've also made two different tuiles. And tuile is it is a cookie, and so they're light and crisp and crunchy. A good example of what a tuile could be is, even though a little on the heavy side, is a fortune cookie. Fortune cookie is just like a tuile. So what I'm going to do is I have a piece of parchment, and in order for plating, I want to plate up my raspberry sauce that I've made. So I'm going to go ahead and make a parchment cone so I can plate with precision. Gonna load up my cone here. Whenever you're working with coronets, you always want to fold the seam away from you. If you don't, then sometimes it can burst open, and then you're covered with what you've got in your coronet. All right, that's look like it's ready to go.
Chef, someone is curious how much of the pâte sucrée dough you can make ahead of time.
You know, it has a pretty long shelf life. I'd
Could
say.
you freeze it?
You could freeze it. I would say that you could probably do, you know, many bake shops will do up to a week's worth at a time. So, all right.
And how much would you need for a standard, say, 8-inch, 9-inch pie or tart dish that most folks would have at home?
I'd say probably between 12 and 14 ounces, because you want to make sure you have a thick enough crust so that it's going to hold all of your delicious fillings. So I'm going to grab my knife for a second here. Okay. So loaded up in my piping bag, I have just some creme chantilly, which is heavy whipping cream, and it is powdered sugar and a little bit of vanilla. And the hallmark of creme chantilly, it is lightly sweet. So in order to get going here, I'm going to start with my blueberry sauce. It's just pureed, cooked down blueberries. Put a little bit on my plate here. Just going to make an artful swoosh. And I'm going to use my creme chantilly in a couple different ways. I'm going to use it to fill my tart, but I'm also going to use it as glue. If I put this down, then when I put my tart shells down or my tuiles, they don't slide around on my plate. So that's ready to go. And I'm going to put some creme chantilly in my tart shell. And this has been whipped to about a medium peak, not quite stiff peak. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and which one should I choose? This one looks pretty good. Ooh, this smells really good, Chef. So I'm going to make small cuts. And I'm then going to take my peaches, kind of fan them out. I'm going to use my small palette knife and place it on the dessert. All right, kind of fan it out. Man, want to make it look as beautiful as possible. Okay. Oh, Chef, I have sorbet in the freezer. Ooh. All right. One moment, please.
I'll get it.
Oh, will you?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All
right. So I'm going to put my tuile right about here. And again, glue. I'm going to use my glue here. Remember when we plate for restaurants, we always want to know that our plate is not going to stay here. Someone has to actually carry it out to our guests. So we want to make sure that everything we put on the plate stays where we want to put it, where we want it to be. Okay. I think I'm going to do this tuile. I like the way it looks. And I'm just going to tack it with my finger. Thank you, Chef. Thank you so much. All right. And I made some raspberry sorbet. And one of the hallmarks of a professional dessert is that we are going to do a quenelle. A quenelle is an egg-shaped ice cream or sorbet. You can do this with 2 spoons. I prefer to do it with 1 spoon. I just use the side of my container and kind of pull it towards me. I want it to be nice and smooth and perfectly egg-shaped. All right. Chef, I think I need some warmer water here. Notice that I keep dipping my spoon in the water. Makes it so I can make a nice smooth shape. There we go. In order to get it off of my spoon, use the heat of my hand. Pull it off, and sorbet goes on. My final addition is just a few dots of the raspberry sauce for art.
Very, very pretty.
There we go. Looks good enough to eat.
Thanks, Chef. So there's several ways that use a classic method in very contemporary ways that I think you can apply easily at home this weekend to make a great party. So there are a couple questions in closing up. For the first dish, could you substitute another vegetable for the parsnip? You could. Let me tell you why I chose parsnip. Parsnip has a sweetness to it when you cook it, much like a carrot, but it doesn't have the color of the carrot. I didn't want an orange sauce on my pork, so I used parsnips for that. You could use something else. I wouldn't use something super strong like a turnip, but you could use yellow carrots, or if you didn't mind the orange color, carrots would taste really, really good. I chose the parsnip more for the aesthetic, and it does have that sweetness when it roasts like a carrot. But that's a good question. Any other questions about any of the braising we did tonight? Again, once you keep in mind how a braise works, that it's the liquid, that it's the things you add to the liquid like the garnish, and it concentrates those flavors, and it puts those flavors into your main dish, whether your main dish is a meat or a vegetable or a fruit. And like I say, it doesn't have to be the old-fashioned big, tough pieces of meat. You can really braise almost anything. Someone is curious if you could add chimichurri to, I'm guessing that's the pork dish? Yes, you could. That'd be great. You know, and I think that's one of the great things about knowing a little about how these techniques work, is you can play with them. You can find an ingredient and you might think that might be great to braise, or this might be great addition to a braising liquid for something that I've already cooked before. So, someone asked a little bit about Chef Stacy and I's experience. Before I came to the school, I had a pretty varied experience. I was a corporate chef for a company that opened brew pubs in the Kansas City area for a long time. So we chose foods that were fun and that paired with beers and that were good for sharing. Pub food, craft pub food. And then I worked for a resort and spa hotel where we catered to people that were there for spa weekends. So they wanted healthier food. Food that they could, that wasn't going to weigh them down while they were doing their spa activities. I'll let Chef Stacy talk about some of the fun places she's been.
I have a lot of experience in working with in restaurants, cafes, bake shops, hotels. So the last places I worked, I was a pastry cook, and it was very high volume, which is its own challenge. So in the time before that, I worked as a pastry chef manager. I had a staff and also managed some of the front of house stuff as well. It was really focused on Korean cuisine, which was really interesting. Never had much experience with that, and I learned a lot in a short amount of time.
Yeah. So Chef Stacy has been here for a couple of years, and she's really becoming a great teacher. I've been with the school for almost 11 years, and I love teaching. We have a fantastic bunch of students, and it's a joy every day to work with them. Okay, well, thank you very much for cooking with us tonight. I hope you try some of these dishes. I hope you try to add something of your own to the dishes, because that's when things get really fun, is when you take something and you take a technique that you know works and you add your own flair to it. So, from the kitchens of Minneapolis St. Paul campus of Le Cordon Bleu, thank you again for coming. Hope you have a great night and try some of these dishes. Have a fun summer and good food.